On August 15th, 1923, Thomas Delaporte, or Delapeur, to use the older form of his family name he had affected in late months, was incarcerated in a barred and padded cell in the Asylum for the Mad at Hanwell. Delapeur, an expatriate Englishman and last scion of an ancient if not venerable baronial line, had only recently arrived from America to take up residence in the newly reappointed seat of the Delapeurs, Exham Priory. He had resolved, all other worldly interests spent, to live out his remaining days in the centuried halls of his forebears. Yet a fate decreed beforehand by his tainted bloodline, an hereditary madness lurking latent only to be nudged to full wakefulness with the proper surroundings as catalyst, assigned him rather different lodgings in which to spend what days remained to him. Padding replaced the black oak panelling and polished wainscoting on the walls around him, though I am told by Dr. Pettijohn that at the last poor Delapeur no longer knew the difference, having sought refuge in the delusion that he dwelt after all in an unsullied Exham, about which hovered legends that were no more than legends and could be easily dismissed. His ghostly rats had left him, or rather they had driven his mind into a retreat in which their spectral echoes could no longer be heard. Thus one paranoiac fancy replaced another, and at length he died in peace, 2 years ago, I believe. His strange case, however, would not be put to rest as easily, for none of the survivors of the party of 7 who had accompanied him on his descent into the Stygian recesses below the Priory could easily forget what we had seen, nor yet the beguiling yet maddening suggestions of what we had not seen, those lightless caverns and abysses that yawned below. All of us sought as best we could to retreat into the numbing comfort of mundane pursuits and wholesome scholarly activities. I now think that Delapeur, in his flight into madness, had chosen the wiser course, as his delusion shielded him from a reality far more insane, a reality the rest of us would seek to face again. We had not sought to stay in contact after the affair of Exham Priory, indeed had sought not to, as if never again to discuss it would lend it the aspect of unreality. One cannot easily dismiss as nightmare what several acquaintances would call in common. All of us were specialists representing different fields, each chosen by Delapeur and his ill-fated companion Norris, based on our reputations. No 2 of us had natural professional acquaintance, so it was easy, by unspoken agreement, to part company and keep quiet. So things remained until we all received copies of a letter from Dr. Randolph Holmes Pettijohn, one of the original party, and an alienist recruited for the adventure by Delapeur, whose recent dreams and apparent auditory hallucinations had led him to suspect his own sanity, rightly, as I once thought. After the tragedy, the murder of Norris, Pettijohn had immediately taken charge of Delapeur and had arranged his committal to Hanwell. The case was so spectacular, from a clinical as well as a journalistic standpoint, that Pettijohn had made it his business to delve into Delapeur's family origins as fully and deeply as time allowed. None of the rest of us knew even this much until the arrival of his letter so informed us. He had at last, he said, made a discovery that shed unexpected light not only upon Delapeur's case, but on our common subterranean adventure as well. Pettijohn was urgent in his insistence that the exploration party regather to hear his findings. After some deliberation, I replied in the affirmative, though my reluctance and foreboding coloured every sentence of my reply. On the appointed day we gathered in the London rooms of Dr. Pettijohn. Besides myself and the alienist, there was, to my surprise, only one other present, the anthropologist Francis Abelard Trask. My initial surprise was mitigated as soon as I recalled that, of the original 7, Norris and Delaper were both now dead, and the unstable psychic Thornton had accompanied Delaper to Hanwell, never to emerge. To tell the truth, I could no longer recall the 7th member, a man I had only briefly met on that occasion. I now assumed he had judged sleeping dogs better left to lie and declined to appear. This was not the meaning attached to the man's absence by Dr. Pettijohn, however, who had for purposes of his inquest secured and maintained information on each of the 7. The absent man was Andrew Powys Thayer, a folklorist expert in the local Ancestor legendary concerning Exham Priory. Delaper had often consulted Thayer as to local folk belief attached to his family seat, and had felt the man's detailed knowledge of the priory and its history prove invaluable in the exploration of its catacombs. Professor Thayer had indeed been sent the identical letter that had summoned Trask and myself, but, as Pettijohn expected, it had gone unanswered. Thayer, a recluse since his retirement from teaching, was often unavailable or unresponsive. But Pettijohn had to conclude that more than this was involved. Upon revisiting Ancestor to interview some of the local workmen and townspeople in connection with the Delaper case, Pettijohn had learned that he was not the first to return there. Thayer, too, had been on the scene with unwelcome inquiries, once even asking after hidden entrances to the priory's interior through unseen crevices of the cliff face. For indeed Exham Priory still stood. Pettijohn had thought it best to deceive Delaper on the matter, informing him of its supposed demolition, and hoping that with the focus of his delusions thus removed, the poor madman might give up his dangerous ancestral fixations. I have said that he did not, Delaper finally rebuilding his priory again in his own mind and living there happily. But very soon the ancient pile would be destroyed in truth, and at the frenzied petitionings of the people of Ancestor. Pettijohn's alarm came from his conviction, unprovable to the authorities, that the eccentric Thayer lurked somewhere, perhaps injured within the walls of Exham Priory. If indeed he were trapped there, there would be no better search party than the 3 of us who had shared his experience and were familiar with the lay of the land. With this Trask and I had to concur. Besides, the only concrete physical danger faced on our previous descent was that from the mad Delaper himself. But what, I asked, of this discovery that so excited Pettijohn? Here his demeanour changed. The severity of concern he felt for the missing Thayer fell away as the gleam of professional, scholarly discovery lit his face. He told us how, judging from the confession of poor Delaper, much of his self-appointed task of reclaiming his ancestral manor was in truth an unconscious quest to cure himself of a kind of family amnesia. Knowledge of his line that had been lost in the burning of Carfax Plantation during the war between the states. Until then, some great secret had been passed in a sealed envelope in the spidery hand of ancestor Walter Delaper from each father on his deathbed to his eldest son. This right of full manhood included not merely the inheritance of the burden of family responsibility, but a burden of self-knowledge too, some secret without knowledge of which one could never know what it was to be a Delacour. Shameful or frightful though the secret might be, ignorance of it might seem worse to a curious mind forever tantalized by its irretrievable absence. Delacour, in the alienist Pettijohn's professional judgment, had been in all his efforts trying to regain that lost knowledge. Apparently he had succeeded, or thought he had, his fevered mind supplying a mad revelation perhaps much worse than any the lost envelope might have contained. Of course, the very existence of the bone-choked Tartarus we seven had stumbled upon beneath Exham Priory lent an undeniable element of the fantastic to Delacour's family history. But who could say if old Walter Delacour, who fled England for American shores, had known of the caverns? Only the flame-obliterated record once sealed in that mysterious envelope might answer that question. Pettijohn's news was that the envelope had in fact come to light. Following the most improbable of hunches, Pettijohn had gambled upon the notorious rapacious tendencies of Federal soldiers during the war. Seldom did they fire a plantation home without sacking it first. Suppose Carfax had been thus ransacked by the Yankees before they torched it? And suppose they had discovered a lockbox they were unable to open? Might not a determined and greedy man have borne his stubborn prize away for further attention later? And minus money and valuables, might not the personal effects, including the sealed letter, have made their way into some closet where, with the passage of decades, they would accumulate a certain antiquarian interest? And might they not have passed thence into the hands of one of the many dealers in such artifacts? It was all improbable, to say the least, absurdly improbable, really, but it would cost the determined researcher little in either money or time to set in motion the necessary inquiries. The trail led at length to a historian on the faculty of one of the border state universities. Astonishingly, the Delacour papers had actually come to rest in the university archives. Pettijohn lost no time in acquiring photostatic copies of the relevant material. It was, as rumoured, the confession of Walter Delacour, he who, fleeing his ancestral England, transplanted his ancient line into the soil of the New World. It was an ill-fated lineage. He could not, after all, extricate himself and his heirs from its predestined shadows, as the experiences of our late friend had demonstrated. Here is the text, slightly updated as to style. It was to have been a great day for me, a rite of passage of some undisclosed sort, unknown to and unsanctioned by the Church, to which our family had always professed formal allegiance, as any lordly house must. I knew that the Delacours had long celebrated certain rituals, held fast to certain beliefs, scarcely common to the run of Englishmen of whatever class, but I never troubled my incurious young head as to their nature or origin. On the single occasion I had asked an aged nursemaid, she had drawn a comparison which I little understood to the marriages of King Solomon to the princesses of 100 heathen kingdoms by way of making peace with them. That satisfied me, if only by way of convincing me I should never understand a matter so obscure and therefore dull. I thought not of it again till my 20th birthday came round, when I was informed with an air of whispered gravity that I should now learn what all the Delacour men, and even women, learned when they came of age. Hitherto the secrets of our immemorial house should be my property as well as my burden, to protect and to maintain. This announcement sounded fully as mystifying as the answer I had received some years previous, but at least it implied that I was now to be trusted with the privileges, albeit of unknown character, attaching to maturity. And this must mean other pleasures and rights that my young mind could understand should be mine as well. It was only some years later, with my growing acquaintance with the ways of a wider world outside Exham Priory, that I understood how late such a rite of maturity had been delayed, occurring some 7 or 8 years earlier in most societies, or so our travellers inform us. I found myself gently shaken awake one midnight by masked servants. I knew their heights and gaits, and thus more than suspected their identities, but I said nothing, feeling vaguely fearful to break their peculiar silence. Once I had relieved myself with the chamber pot and splashed my face to some degree of wakefulness, I returned to my bedside, where the two servants had laid out a yellow silken robe for me, much like theirs, though of a discernibly finer material. Once I had donned it, I felt I had stepped onto a stage, and was already performing, along with these other actors, in a play whose script I had never laid eyes on. What should my role be? I could only accompany them and wait. The light in my room had come from a pair of torches which my visitors had brought with them, passing them back and forth as each required free hands to help or guide me. The shrouded figures now held them aloft as we paced solemnly down familiar halls, and through secret doors cleverly set into walls in such a manner that no seam or crack suggested, much less betrayed, their presence. My curiosity now blazing more brightly than our torch flames, I followed in a mood of adventurous expectancy. One has perhaps entertained dreams of stumbling upon a hitherto unknown chamber in one's house. I now experienced such a dream in very truth. True, I had never mentally traced out the probable contours of the vast pile in which my family resided, but long familiarity with our capacious quarters had banished any curiosity about what I might not have seen. Now I was seeing it, and the further our miniature procession wended its way through labyrinthine corridors, forever downward, the greater my sense of wonder grew, and forsooth I questioned more than once whether I was caught in a dream, my physical body yet reclining asleep in its warm bed. But it would prove all too real, unless even to this hour I sleep and pitch amid unending nightmare. I noticed in the flickering light how the plaster-coated walls along which we passed were covered with murals of a decadent Roman type. I mean their artistic style, but their subject too deserved the epithet. There were scenes of bloody flagellation, apparently of masters and mistresses by servants, offering to infants to ancient deities or demons on altars shaped like gaping maws. Most disturbingly, the persons depicted were dressed not in ancient togas, but in the familiar clothing of our own day. There were, too, more familiar scenes of great hunting parties, then also of butcher shops, not an accustomed subject for artistic representation. Still other scenes involved forms plainly human and animal, but others also, and the peculiar relative positions of all the painted forms suggested the repugnant. We descended endless spirals of stairs, beaten smooth with the treading of centuries, until the sounds of chanting reached my ears. When we reached our destination, what I expected would be an initiation chamber, the place was cold, damp and hollow, though the barrenness was broken by the hanging of great black and purple drapes of velvet. Banqueting tables formed a great square at whose centre there lay a feather mattress, also of black velvet. Thrown into the nightish surface was the armigerous crest of the Delapeurs. Patches of discoloration were not difficult to pick out, even in the wavering illumination of the bracketed candles. All other chairs were occupied but one. My guides led me silently to my chair, and, as I sat down, I scanned the rows of guests, hoping for some sign of recognition. While I assumed most or all would be familiar to me unmasked and in proper daylight, I could guess at the identity of none of them. There were rather too many for all of them to represent the resident menfolk of the Delapeur clan, and this suggested the possibility of honoured guests from outside our family home, though certainly no locals could be here. At second glance I took note both that the robes, all shining golden in the torchlight, were yet of different shades, some tending more toward red, others toward the palest yellow. Were they significant of rank within what was now plainly some esoteric order cherished by my ancient line, or was the choice of colours entirely gratuitous? Perhaps these and other details awaited a catechism that should ensue upon completion of whatever ceremony awaited me. But was it not proper order for instruction to precede initiation rather than follow it? Unless, of course, the idea were for the initiate to get in too deep, become implicated, and be unable henceforward to turn back. In many ways I was as naive as I was young, but the reader will know that no Delapeur can long remain without a necessary degree of craft and guile. The banquet began and continued in absolute silence, and yet the movements and gestures of all appeared convivial, even festive, as if one were to observe a raucous surfeit through a screen that muffled all sound. It was unearthly in effect, nor did the momentary uplifting of silken veils furnish much of a glimpse of the identity beneath. Once the diner rose to his feet, as if to read from an unrolled scroll. But when, in his pantomime, he made a quarter turn, I could see that the vellum surface was entirely as blank as his hooded visage. And somehow it was only then that it occurred to my marvelling senses that many of the guests' hoods had no visible eye-holes. In such a state of dreamlike confusion, I finally turned my attention to the plate before me, only to wonder again at what lay thereupon. Meat of more than one variety totally unfamiliar to me was passed me from circulating platters or by the attentive hands of costumed servants. Much of this repast fairly swam in blood, ordinarily no affront to me, but occasional strands of human hair amid the meaty chunks extinguished my appetite. The voiceless reading of the invisible text was, it turned out, the beginning of the ceremonies of the night. Events succeeded one another rapidly from here on in. Once the plates were taken away, replaced by flagons of familiar wine and ale, the after-dinner entertainment commenced. Armed gentlemen, their faces but crudely masked with wound-up rags and kerchiefs, brought in a series of girls and young women, villagers from the looks of them, some seemingly not fed for many days, and half led, half dragged each one in turn through a gap at the corner where the banquet tables had been drawn to an incomplete square. All were naked, none masked, and the bruises of ill-treatment during captivity were plainly to be seen. I know that, even in our advanced century, the nobility, if the name be used of such men, abused their baronial privileges much as our tyrannical ancestors had. Such things were less tolerated now, but the common peasantry still suffered much. How much I was about to learn. What measure of threatening or bribery had it taken to persuade local fathers to sell their nubile daughters to the servants of their Delapeur masters? And could the girls have been allowed to know what fates they were about to suffer? For next I saw the use of the stained mattress, as one after the other, the robed dignitaries on the side of the table square opposite mine began to cast aside their garments, all but their facial coverings, revealing themselves in a disgusting state of animal arousal. They lost no time in positioning themselves astride the firmly bound, vainly struggling forms of the village girls beneath them, the latter screaming through muffled gags. I felt not only disgust, but self-loathing as well, for I knew it was my kind, my caste, my kin, who perpetrated these outrages and thought nothing of it, any more than a hunter bringing down game birds for idle target practice. Strangely, I did not yet think of intervening. I cannot account for my paralysis of will, save that I felt I must be locked in nightmare's grasp when, following on each lewd predation, the perpetrator received from the attendant guardsman a long knife, with which he proceeded to slit the throat of his erstwhile plaything. Each new violator then went on to kneel and to copulate in the bloody mess left by his predecessor. Each was guided away from the chamber and presumably into some adjacent lavatory by one of the guards, as if exhausted in the course of a wholesome athletic exertion. Through all this my mind seemed to me to float outside of my body, rejecting what it could not tolerate. The next entertainments of the evening involved no direct participation from the gathered feasters. We were this time to be spectators only. But for me, the ensuing sights were scarcely less easy to bear. The supply of local females was not exhausted, but this time they were made the unwilling partners, not of our own number, but of a series of rutting brutes whose nature was at no time clear to me. Were they hairless hogs, such as I had never seen among our squealing pens? Were they heavily muscled dwarfs from some countryside circus troupe? Their priapic skill, albeit soul-upheaving in its crudeness, was efficient enough, and directly after penetration they were taken firmly in hand by weapon-bearing guardsmen and led away. The young women, passed out from their ordeal, then received the amorous attentions of the line of robed diners adjacent to my own flank of the board. I was, of course, uneasily aware that some hideous behaviour would be expected of me at some moment not long distant, but I could not actively consider what it might be as long as my attention was commanded by terrible sights such as these. The masked revellers, some with the help of their burly attendants, lifted the dead weight of the women's legs to facilitate their own thrusting. The physical condition of some of these men, both long given to idle vice, and in some cases subject to astonishing and unparalleled anatomical deformities, made the oblivion of the supine females a blessing indeed. I would, shortly thereafter, be made aware, by the local authorities, that what I had witnessed must have been the process by which the degenerate Delapeurs replenished both their noble line and their meat larder, depending upon which seed should take hold. This is why these wasted females were not, like their predecessors, butchered at once. This, I say, I learned later, but at the time my senses were assaulted anew by the realization that a pair of these women were not, after all, unknown to me. They, unlike the rest, had been brought in and laid down wearing hoods like those of the diners. When I saw this, I instinctively glanced at a corner where I had seen two female feasters, only to confirm their absence now. But as first the semi-human brutes, then the human ones, had their way with the passive, degraded forms, the veil of one unresisting woman fell aside, and I recognized the once sweet face of my sister Elizabeth, now foully enraptured in a manner I dare not picture. It came home to me that I must be next, and that whatever rite of initiation they had engineered must be of such a specially foul nature that, having descended to such depravity, I should have seared my conscience forever, unable to tolerate any degree of guilt or qualms henceforth, lest I loathe myself to the point of suicide. In such fashion was the absolute loyalty of the Delapeurs secured, one generation after another. I claim no credit for what I will now report. Indeed, in what I did next I only compounded the guilt of my hitherto passive presence in that inferno of horrors. But I did what I must. First I reached for the dagger I had donned out of habit, along with some underclothes to protect myself from the cold of the night beneath the light texture of the ceremonial garb I had donned. I rose from the table and approached one of the guards, who, preoccupied with the depraved spectacle before him, was scarcely anticipating my assault. I stabbed his fat neck with my dagger, at once seizing the haft of his antique halberd, which he and his fellows carried for some purely ornamental purpose. Still, in the confines of that room it proved a deadly weapon. As he gagged on his own blood, I ran for the other 2 or 3 armed men, dispatching them easily, half drunk as they seemed. Next I made for the door through which I had entered, bolting it, and then I set about butchering all who remained. Like stupid cattle they moaned plaintively, scarce able to comprehend the due recompense that was at last overtaking them. None made more than half-hearted attempts to fend off my deadly blows, offering less resistance than a tree being hacked up for kindling. Dripping with their foul blood, and none of my own, I turned over the heaped corpses and stripped off the hoods that remained, recognizing beneath the distorted and purpled visages of father, brothers, uncles, aunts, cousins. No pang of remorse did I feel just then, though later I knew myself a murderer, albeit of murderers and worse. I rose from my finished work, and remembered the hallway through which the doomed women had been led. I found a better weapon, a sword, in the belt of one of the slain guards, and headed for the dark aperture. There was but the feeblest of light to illuminate the silence with shivering shadows. Of armed men I saw no more. In fact, the only ones I did discover, cowering in tears, were my sisters Elizabeth and Rosamond, both of whom I now realized had taken their turn on the blood-soaked mattress. Their glazed eyes pleaded silently, but I showed them no mercy. They were no longer the kind, I judged, on whom mercy can be shown, any more than a poisonous serpent may be forgiven. Ascending the stairs with renewed vigour, I passed through to the residential levels of Exham Priory. My hand was firm upon my borrowed blade, and I searched the place, room by room, with vengeful stealth, but found no one. Perhaps, alerted by one or two who had managed to flee before me, all servants, remaining relatives, and visiting tradesmen had made their hasty exit, as if from a sinking ship. Satisfying myself that no other human being now populated these haunted halls, I packed the few clothes and papers I needed, and left the old heap of stones for once and all. When I reached the village below, news of my deeds had preceded me, and I fully expected to be executed on the spot. But instead, I found myself hailed as liberator and benefactor. Thanking the villagers with a full heart, I remained with them long enough to put my affairs in order, and to make ready for my final journey to those shores where, after long years during which no horrible detail had faded from my memory, I have decided to set the events down, hoping that the act may exorcise them from my mind, waking and sleeping, where they have never yet ceased to plague me. Future generations of the Delacour line may shudder at the knowledge of the rock from which they were hewn, but they may also comfort themselves with the knowledge that, with me, the family has cleansed itself of its terrible guilt, which no future Delacour ever need bear again. Pettijohn felt that the shocking legacy of the Delacours or Delacours might finally be laid to rest by a return trip to the caverns beneath Exham Priory. What difference did it make, Thomas Delacour being dead 2 years? Neither Trask nor I asked this question. The Delacour madness was so singular, opening up new lines of inquiry into the much-debated question of ancestral memory, that no men of the psychological sciences could in good conscience fail to try to resolve it. And in no better conscience could Trask, an anthropologist, and I, an archaeologist, continue to pretend deafness to the sirens of lost knowledge that had tempted us since that initial descent. We would return to the Priory, come what may. With luck we would find our colleague. As men we could hope no less. But as scientists we could hope for a great deal more. The initial entry into Exham Priory was not half the obstacle we had anticipated. Though I am loath to trade on the modest fame my work has earned me, the rehearsing of my credentials, plus the implication by Dr. Pettijohn that his investigations were aimed at the final extirpation of the Delacour blight, proved sufficient to gain the limited cooperation of the local authorities, as the missing folklorist Thayer had been unable to do. We retraced our steps with a shiver of déjà vu, recalling too vividly our first expedition with Thomas Delacour. The series of sub-cellars reminded me of the circle of Dante's Inferno, but I knew we traversed but the antechamber of hell. The cleverly hidden altar stone designed to mask the netherworld of the Delacours still stood tipped open. None of us had thought to restore it to its original position in our precipitous departure nearly a year before. As we crouched to pass this portal into pandemonium, I understood another piece of the Priory's puzzle. Local law spoke of an inner cult to which only certain even of the tainted Delacours would be initiated. I now knew that whatever blasphemous revels of defilement occupied the demented clan as a whole, they must have been restricted to the Roman-era chambers we were now quitting. Only the inner initiates would be informed of the twilight grotto below. Else why disguise the doorway to it beneath a secret altar stone which none outside the family might see in the first place? Had the parricide Walter de la Peur known of the secret cult and its netherworld? No doubt the outer Attis and Kibberley cultists, with its orgies of castration and infanticide, would have been enough to provoke his desperate act. But we were going deeper, to those levels of nightmare the visitation of which had driven Thomas de la Peur to cannibalistic insanity. Beneath us stretched away the skeleton-scattered plain dotted with architectural stragglers from Roman, Celtic, Saxon, and Jacobean times. All this we had seen, and despite our best efforts, we had all of us failed to forget a single detail of it. Trask and I had come prepared with cameras and as many photographic plates as we might accommodate in our rucksacks, hoping to gather enough evidence to persuade the government authorities, in the name of science, to delay the planned destruction of so singular a site. So we paused to record as much of the unearthly scene as we might, then headed for terra incognita. On our first trip we had not penetrated the deeper recesses of the place, as we had nothing approaching adequate lighting. The dim twilight of the place was supplied by the unseen cliff fissures that let in the cool breezes that alone made the place sufferable. But out of the range of that faint luminescence we had not dared explore further. This time we were prepared. High-intensity chemical torches, plus an ample supply of matches, more secretive illumination proved advisable, now made further descent practicable. I will not tax the patience of our readers who may not share my own scholarly pedantry with all the details of our exploration. These may be found in the official reports. Suffice it to say that we found a series of once-inhabited caverns, all connected by well-worn, sometimes almost effaced, stone steps. Given the curious mix of architectural styles evident on the topmost layer, we did not know what to expect below. If I had had to guess, I would have predicted that the structures on the lower levels would have been of more recent design the deeper one went. The variety of styles up top would have reflected the continuous use of the area through the ages, with the lower levels reflecting a gradual tunneling descent as more space became necessary, for whatever blasphemous ends. Hence, each lower level ought to show more recent style. In fact, though the evidence was not altogether unequivocal, the very opposite seemed to be the case. The further down one went, the earlier in style the structures, or their ruins, became. This finding comported well with my tentative observation on our initial exploration, that the tunneling seemed to evidence stroke marks from below. At that time I assumed the unusual effect to be the result of some ancient and inefficient constructional technique. Now I began to see the evidence in a bewildering new light. Stranger still were the apparently contradictory indications of more decadent secondary workmanship that became more inept, almost appearing hurried and careless as one descended. The secondary character of what seemed to be renovations was evident from the plain contrast with the finer work that prevailed generally on every level. My only guess was that the more recent reworkings reflected a route of retreat back underground. Stray relics, such as cups and utensils anachronistically scattered on the wrong levels, tended to confirm this hypothesis. Actually, the general interpretation of the data seemed fairly clear, but the tendency of it equally seemed scarcely capable of belief. From whence could these ancient tunnellers have come? Often we came upon stretches of tunnel wall that had once, I am sure, been hung with tapestries. All that now remained, thanks to the corrosive effects of the sea salt air that penetrated the cliffs, were discoloured shreds. Yet it could be seen that the intricately woven arras had once borne complex and detailed scenes, which presumably enshrined stories important to and informative of the weavers, whoever they may have been. Trask had stayed behind, attempting to catalogue some of the queer semi-human skeletons and skeleton fragments that thickly littered the topmost cavern floor. Now, sketches and photographic plates tucked away, he caught up with Pettijohn and myself. Without living subjects to interview, poor Pettijohn had had no research with which to busy himself, while Trask worked on his skeletons, and I studied the various ruins and artifacts. But soon his patience was rewarded. At first the three of us thought we were becoming the prey of Delaper's auditory hallucinations. We seemed to hear the scuffling of animal feet from further down the tunnel. We gave our lights a rest, following the ghostly radiance of phosphorescent fungi which covered the nighted walls on this level. If such plant life existed here, it was not inconceivable that there were animals of some sort as well. After assuring each other that we all heard the sounds, unlike the case of poor Delaper, whose rats only he could hear, we agreed to creep slowly forward to spy whatever animal might be grazing on the fungi. We were not quiet enough, for instantly we heard the confusion of a group of apparently clumsy animals lumbering away out of sight. But their herdsman remained. Directly before us, half turned as if to follow his fleeing charges, stood a stooped and skeletal figure. His dirty white hair hung in strings from his face and head, penetrated by the startled gaze of red-rimmed eyes. The clothes were filthy rags that hung precariously from his spare frame, and his shepherd's crook was a walking-stick that revealed him to be, like ourselves, a visitor from the upper world. His pallid, almost translucent skin implied he had been here much longer than we, however. He looked alarmed, but more than that, he stared in disbelief. He made no move. I spread my hands to show I meant no harm and began to speak. I hardly knew where to begin. Could he have been a shepherd in the Ancestor area who followed lost animals through one of the hypothetical hidden entrances to the caves? But then how to account for his apparent at-homeness here? I thought it better to explain our presence first and let him react to that. I told him that a family called the Delapers had once lived here, or above here, intending to tell him of our former and present missions. But at the mention of the syllables Delaper, the ancient herdsman's rheumy eyes widened fully to perfect circles, and, spewing spittle, he unbottled a verbal torrent. "Used to live here, you say? You don't know the half of it, you don't. Why, I knows all about them Delapers. Knows too much, I do. More'n you might expect from the look o' me. Them devils been stealing babies and young girls for centuries hereabouts, and ain't nobody that don't know that. But here he tapped his head and squinted one eye, knows plenty more'n that, I does. I knows what they did aforetimes in these here caves, all the breedin' and the killin' and the victualizin'. Regular epicures, them Delapers." I noticed mentally how the mad oldster had begun to use words with which I would not have thought him familiar, given his crude and wild demeanour. "I knows all about the livestock they raised in them pens up there, and where they'd go betimes to fatten that herd. And I knows what they begat on the village girlies, I does. And rats, knows all about them, I does." Here the tottering greybeard began to prance erratically from foot to foot, breaking forth into a child's ditty I had heard for years concerning one Bishop Hatto, who in a time of famine had invited the poor into his huge barn, ostensibly to distribute provisions, while actually luring them into a death trap. Locking them in, his grace set fire to the barn. Then, when he saw it could hold no more, Bishop Atto made fast the door, and while for mercy on Christ they call, he set fire to the barn and burnt them all. Soon after, divine justice overtook the wicked bishop in the form of a plague of famine-starved rats, who swept down upon his estates and devoured all in their path, pointedly including Bishop Hatto. "They have whetted their teeth against the stones, and now they pick the bishop's bones. They gnawed the flesh from every limb, for they were sent to do judgment on him. No fairy tale, me kind sirs, it happened, right here. But that bishop weren't no Christian bishop, no, sir. Served the old gods, he did. A de la purr. He roasted them people right enough, but one by one, for supper." In his delvings the unfortunate Thomas de la Purr had become acquainted with a whole cycle of legends concerning the rat plague, and had informed me of these when initially recruiting my efforts. The gnaw marks we found on the skeletons on the topmost level seemed conclusive evidence of a link between the story of the rats and the evil of Exham Priory. But how could this senile old rustic be expected to make such a connection? Trask, Pettijohn, and I were all too amazed to think of interrupting the crazed old swineherd. "But the worst o' it is what most folk don't know, but I knows. Them devil de la Purrs still live here. They never died, just went back underground after young Walter's deed back in 1610. He killed the sire and his legal family, but them devils breed like rats, bred with rats of a kind, and they was plenty of 'em as had never seen the outside of the Priory. Just went down below, and they been going deeper every generation. But 'tain't really the de la Purrs, you know, any more'n it was the Romans. They just got sucked into it, like all the rest." I could resist no longer. Who then? Who was it that tunnelled up from below, that built this place? The old man paused, savouring my rapt attention, as if considering whether to divulge this bit of information for free. "They was the little people, the old ones of the hills." Trask broke in. "Of course. Miss Murray speaks of them in the witch cult in Western Europe. Most anthropologists dismiss her theories as wild conjectures, but—" "But," finished the mad old herdsman, "she right, ain't she, Dr. Trask? He he he." Our jaws dropped as one. We had found Andrew Powys Thayer, retired professor of folklore studies, University of Sheffield. In his seeming insanity he had reverted to the plebeian accents of his childhood, but the filth-clad old spectre's memory still served him. Of the long conversation which followed, let me report only the gist. Thayer hailed originally from the Ancestor countryside himself, and, despite his later intellectual achievements, had never quite forgotten his humble origins. Indeed, it was the rich, if frightening, lore of his village that had first inclined him to the science of comparative folklore. Mastering the tools of the discipline, he had returned to the mass mythology of his home region, and had actually founded his academic career on the ancestor Exham legendary, systematizing and cataloguing it in a dissertation still regarded as a classic in the field. No wonder Thomas de la Pere had found him so inexhaustible a source of information, albeit disturbing, about his ancestral seat. Hearing, as we had, of the impending demolition of the Priory, Thayer had resolved to get a second, closer look at the caverns below it. He realized that the wealth of local legends to which he had dedicated his professional life was but the tip of the iceberg. Once inside the cliff face and its caverns, he had taken pretty much the same path we had mere hours before. He had found what he sought, but much more as well. For the de la Pere clan, as he now mumbled, still lived, more degenerate, more terrible, and more secretive than ever. When Thayer had penetrated into their lair, he had first been seized and bound in one of the butcher's sheds which were familiar to him from our first common descent in the company of de la Pere and Norris. When Thayer had penetrated into their lair, he had first been seized and bound in one of the butcher's sheds which were familiar to him from our first common descent in the company of de la Pere and Norris. Weeks passed in this captivity before, as he supposed, the stock of flabby albino anthropoids ran thin, and the swathed and hooded butcher picked him to die. He was rudely stripped and tied to the block, dull-bladed axe about to descend on his scrawny turkey neck, when the downward arc abruptly halted, and the muffled tones of the butcher grunted something in a semi-coherent, decadent patois. Hastily led into the presence of several other carefully shaded and mantled figures, Thayer's spare, nude form was inspected with rude jabs and close peering through masked eyes. After much whispering and grunting, the dazed Thayer was at length made to understand that through the presence of some obscure birthmark or anatomical configuration, the furtive figures had recognized him as a distant relation. In his own veins flowed a sluggish stream of impure de la Pere blood, tainted with the infection of unguessable, doubtfully human ancestors. Instead of a livestock pen, he was given his own dwelling. Thayer had adjusted with difficulty to his new petty aristocratic status in the unsuspected underground realm. Communicate with his new-found kin he could not, as their speech had decayed beyond any surface dweller's grasp. Nor would his hosts unveil themselves in his presence. He received the impression, from what seemed intimate scenes stumbled upon, that the netherworlders neither uncovered themselves in each other's presence. Whatever deformity resulted from centuries of inbreeding, perhaps the re-emergence of the recessive traits of pre-human ancestry, it seemed to be shared by all, yet universally regarded with a repugnance that must be the only surviving vestige of surface human existence. Anthropologist Trask listened with renewed fascination as Thayer began disjointedly to explain what he had been able to understand of the social structure of the cavern's world. It was a system of class privilege, but not of law. It was apparently a fairly small society, though even Thayer had not had occasion to find out the full extent of the subterranean world. The concept of prescriptive law had been alien to the original founders of the mysterious race. They, it appeared, lived in harmony with the inner laws of their species, those natural laws forming the basis of custom and ritual. However these customs of incest and cannibalism might clash, had clashed, with the mores of surface dwellers, whether Cymric, Roman, Saxon, or English, they were deemed wholly natural by the denizens below Exham Priory. The tiers of this society were organized on the basis of racial purity. The more direct one's descent from the founders, the higher the status one held. Those whose blood contained more or less admixture with the various races assimilated over the millennia were more or less inferior in the social scale. Class privilege was largely a matter of initiation into inner circles of the cult. Of these, there seemed fully as many as are rumoured among the Masons. Only the outermost fringe of the concentric initiation system was visible in the affairs of the surface-dwelling Delapeurs. The first level involved nameless feasts of human and semi-human flesh, that of the flabby beasts nourished on the coarse vegetation harvested from the gardens of the Priory. It was merely this that had spurred Walter de la Peur to murder his accessible family and flee to America in 1610. These feasts, with their orgies of mutilation and carousal, had been preceded by rites and liturgies in the Attis temple below the Priory. The second level involved not just the slaughter of, but the blasphemous interbreeding with, the awful fungus beasts in the twilight grotto below. The innermost circle of the cult, known to Thayer, involved the consumption of the well-preserved and seasoned corpses of the mummified progenitors of the cult. Here even Pettijohn, inured as he was to the aberrations of the insane, blanched and nearly fainted. In some vague way this process was held to reincarnate the original elder ones. Of these only one remained in the flesh. It was called the faceless god. Thayer had glimpsed this entity but once during a high festival when it appeared for a moment upon its dais, flanked by two of the mindless, flabby subhumans, which had somehow been trained to play what must have passed for melodies on two cracked, shrill flutes. The faceless god derived its title from the bulging mask of yellow silk it wore, which, from the asymmetrical protrusions beneath it, must have veiled a physiognomy not only inhuman, but positively non-Euclidean in its dimensions. To the presence of this numinous monarch the only response was immediate prostration, so the awed Thayer had caught only a glimpse before the indescribable form retreated again into occultation. Thayer had clearly been transfigured by the experience. He seemed to view it now as an exaltation never experienced by lesser mortals, now as equally unparalleled degradation, depending upon the random mood of the moment. In any case, he refused to leave his sacred duties as a herdsman of the fungus-fattened cattle. Besides, if he tried, he would surely be found by agents of the cult, who still foraged on certain nights among the young females of Ancestor. He would take his chances with the dynamiting of the Priory, feeling confident that no harm would come to those who lived so far below the surface. Pettijohn, Trask, and myself, however, he admonished to leave now and not come back. This warning put the three of us in a quandary. On the one hand, we had accomplished our humanitarian goal of finding the missing Thayer. If he wanted to stay where he was, even if it was in a hell inconceivable to sane minds, that was his decision. On the other hand, how could we turn back without verifying even a little of the wild tale Thayer had told us? Yet, if it were even half true, we would be placing ourselves in extreme danger if we explored further. Thayer assured us he would not try to stop us, but it would be on our own heads. The tattered form turned down the passageway into which his fungoid flock had lately vanished. We took the other path. After another mile or so of gradually sloping descent, we began to notice certain changes in the environment. There appeared to be no fungus growing here, hence no ghostly illumination, so we reluctantly reactivated our torches, probably because it had grown less moist. I began to think I could discern the echoes of faint and distant piping. In view of Thayer's mad ramblings, I was not eager to happen upon the echo's possible source. At the same time, the darkness began to lighten almost imperceptibly with a misty purplish radiance. Surely we must be nearing another level of the underground labyrinth. Soon we exhausted the supply of steps. A cave mouth yawned before us. Tentatively we crept to its rim and looked out. What I saw gave credence to the whispered legends of a flight of 7,000 onyx steps that led to the gate of deeper nightmare. For there stretched out what seemed to be a featureless, windowless city of black basalt, a collection of weed-grown terraces, collapsing towers, crumbling minarets, cracked domes, and tenuous bridges suspended over oily black rivers of unwholesome ooze. This could be none other than the primal and ultimate citadel of the awful entities from whose evil roots the poisonous mushroom of Exham Priory had sprouted. As none of the inhabitants seemed to be in evidence, we bade Prudence good-bye, yielding to Pandoran curiosity as we made for the nearest building. Of furniture the place had none, so it was difficult to assess whether it was momentarily or permanently untenanted. The sole decoration in the rather large domed hall was a huge mural tapestry, which I judged to correspond to that whose mere shreds I had discovered earlier in the day, or on the previous day. By our flickering light the three of us studied the scenes, trying to make sense of the images which reflected no known culture or artistic style. The reader will recall that my professional judgment on such a matter, however extravagant it may sound, is to be accepted. To my bafflement was added the disturbing insight of Dr. Pettijohn, whose analytical techniques include the inference of personality type and psychic health from a patient's drawings. He whispered that some subtle aberration in the style suggested a characteristic state of mind wholly without parallel among the common run of mankind. His judgment is all the more unsettling when it is recalled that what we were viewing was apparently a conventionalized representational style, not the idiosyncratic manner of a single individual. Dr. Trask, too, was hard-pressed to make sense of the physical forms represented in the hours before him. Not only were they but vaguely suggestive of Homo sapiens, they could scarcely be placed at any conjectural point in the known cycle of terrestrial evolution. At last we came upon another tapestry which suggested unavoidably the answers our minds had tired themselves in suppressing. I believe that what we saw depicted the arrival at some time in the remote dawn era of our planet of these elder ones, the parent stock of the hellish Delapeurs from another world altogether. By piecing together various equivocal hints from this and that scene, we inferred that these beings' homeworld had been slowly rendered uninhabitable. First, the surface grew contaminated in some unspecified way, represented by layers of piled-up dots surrounding natural features, whereupon all survivors took refuge underground. Thus began their troglodyte existence. When that shelter too became unlivable some years or epochs later, they had somehow gained the capacity to travel through space, or so this their myth said. This Earth was their destination. Though the surface of the planet would have accommodated them, they had grown so accustomed to underground life that they shunned the clean sunlight for the inner darkness. There was more, much more, recorded in that arras, which I supposed must be a standard household relic, much as a crucifix or religious statue is in many of our familiar households. Or perhaps, it occurred to me later, it was something of a port of entry at which novice abductees or initiates to the cult were shown the nature of the new and horrifying world in which they must henceforth dwell. We had time to decipher but a small fraction of the mad revelations. Indeed, I suspect far madder than the little we could interpret. But inevitably we were interrupted. I should have realized we were left unmolested only as long as our unseen hosts chose to study us from concealment. For suddenly a rustling behind a section of tapestry indicated the rush of air from a hidden door swiftly opening. The doorway was at once seen to be full of curious and threatening troglodytes, all eager to get a look, like the ancient men of Sodom, at these improbable interlopers into their sunken realm. That we had not noticed the clumsy footfalls of the shambling herd, for none of whom stealth could conceivably have been an option, is to be credited to our utter absorption as we sought to decipher the hanging mural. Absent-minded professors, in truth. We had but moments to stare at the looming figures, even as they dumbly scrutinized us, before they roughly took us in hand and marched us away. But in those moments I took in more than I wish now that I had. All were swathed in shapeless garments, coarse sacks really. Faces were one and all veiled, albeit protruding asymmetrically, leaving only deep-set blazing eyes visible if the feeble light chanced to catch them. The stench was unimaginable, and I shall do you no favours if I try to describe it. But the worst thing, I think, was the irregularity of the limbs, in so far as they could be distinguished from the general mass. For no two seemed to form a good match, and I could have sworn one of the mute vigilantes possessed a rudimentary third leg, or perhaps a tail. I averted my glance, having for the moment lost all sense of scientific objectivity. But even the most pious missionary may, I suppose, be forgiven for forgetting his concern for souls while he is being prepared for a cannibalistic dinner. And that, I assumed, was now to be our fate. The paths we trod along cavernous ledges were worn smooth from uncounted centuries of foot traffic. So many millennia of path-beating had given the path a degree of reassuring concavity, leaving a curve along the outer edge, so that there was no urgent danger of losing one's footing and falling headlong into the abyss, past honeycombed hive walls embedded in the cone-like pit. Souls crushed by despair, frames past feeling from hours of strenuous descent, He moved along like the obedient beasts which we had earlier seen old Thayer shepherding along the tunnel shafts. It could not have been unduly long before my colleagues and I were ushered into a holding cell of sorts, a dug-out chamber similar in its plainness to the residential chamber we had previously entered. There were moth-eaten, faded hangings here, too, only these were given entirely over to the depiction of cruel tortures and dismemberments the like of which, we supposed, we should anticipate for ourselves. The fiendishness of some of these damnations, though shown as inflicted by mortals, rivaled in their degree of sadistic horror the nether hells of the Tibetan Buddhists, far surpassing the dull imagination of the monkish Catholic inquisitors of more recent times. More disturbing yet, however, was the implied anatomy of the poor wretches whose tortures were here represented. Were the unlikely contortions and freakish angles into which bare limbs were twisted the product of hellish torments, or, worse, the natural state of their naked bodies before the engines of cruelty were applied? Fear yielded to utter and absolute exhaustion at that point. I doubt that the torture devices under whose likenesses we slept could have kept us awake. I cannot venture a guess how long we slept, but to my surprise we were allowed to awaken naturally. When my eyes opened, my friend Trask was watching me amid a circle of equally patient guards, while Pettijohn was nowhere to be seen. I never caught a glimpse of him again, nor could I find an opportunity to ask the mysterious Thayer about him. He is henceforth absent from this narrative, I am sorry to say. I hope and trust he now rests in peace. Of our captors, a single visage was not covered, and it was of course that of our former companion, Thayer. It was he who had seen to our clemency, the prerogative of the minor noble rank which he possessed in this peculiar society. Might this treatment portend more of the same? I could tell by the discomfited state of my clothes that they had been removed and put back while I slept so deeply. They had not been washed. My captors must have searched me, as they had Thayer, looking for any identifying arcana, but there would have been nothing for them to find. Momentarily, I wished I might have indulged in a youthful desire to acquire a tattoo. Who knows what sort of royal crest the poor savages might have seen in that? But, alas, my wrinkled skin was pure as the driven snow, and I gather the same must have held for Trask. Though our old colleague now counted as one of them, it was impossible to bear Thayer any ill will, much less hostility. He was, after all, our only lifeline here. Any benefit, any amelioration of our predicament he might seek could undermine his own position among these strange denizens of the shadow realm. It was thus with the most sincere gratitude that Trask and I received our verdicts, actually our assignments to new lives in this alien society into which we had stumbled as hapless immigrants. Needless to say, we could never be allowed to leave it. Whether opportunity might one day present itself, who could say? But, despite my physical soundness, my years were sufficiently advanced as to reduce my potential for heroics to a minimum, and any such options were, I am sorry to say, to be ruled out for the more fragile form of Trask. I think he knew this, for I saw his facial lines sink into a posture of resignation from which I dare say they never again lifted. Was he even grateful to be left alive in such circumstances? I never got the chance to ask him, for the pair of us were split up and taken to different cave cells, separated by an unknown distance. Some cryptic utterance of Thayer's gave me to believe that Trask should henceforth have some assigned task in the kitchens of our district of the sparsely populated cavern world. Its populace appeared to survive on the most meagre of sustenance. The monotonous menu consisted primarily of the bloated and strangely coloured, though in this odd light who could tell, fungi. The loathsome meat of the flabby creatures of Thayer's herd was seemingly reserved to a more elite class of epicures, higher up the aristocratic chain, for which I may say I was devoutly grateful. Caste duties dictated the activities of the largely silent denizens who resembled, in their behaviour, nothing so much as the instinct-driven drones of an insect hive. If there remained, or had ever existed, any wider cultural life, I saw no sign of it. Occasionally a look over the protective curb of the curving path of descent offered a glimpse of silent, shambling figures headed to unknown destinations on unguessable missions, and with all the enthusiasm of a surface world chain gang. Clearly it was a ghost of a civilization, lost even unto itself, its pointless existence maintained strictly by force of inertia. I stress this so that you may see how little inclined the shadowy rulers of the place were to close supervision. When things move predictably and without variation, one eventually comes to cast a sleepy eye over the inevitable, like a sleepy night watchman. As a new variable in the equation, I found myself doubly conspicuous. Not only was I the only new thing to scrutinize, but I was also the only occasion to revive the atrophied exercise of scrutinizing anything. And, once I understood this, I began to think there might be a way to escape what little notice was taken of me. It was some months before I chanced to see again my friend and fellow prisoner Trask, and when I did, I saw with alarm how he wielded a crudely wrought crutch, more of a stick or a club, to compensate for a newly missing left leg. That his health and physical soundness should have failed did not surprise me. Indeed, I could imagine that, while recoiling from the easy prospect of suicide in this place, Professor Trask might yet have relished the prospect of death coming to relieve his trials sooner rather than later. I only hoped that whatever passed for medicine or surgery in these precincts was not too similar to the methods of torture whose depiction I had once seen on the tapestry. What was my own role in this bizarre society to be? An old man, I might have seemed good for little, but I can only suppose that Dr. Thayer had made the hierarchs to understand something of my work as a scholar, for I found myself delivered to a great chamber of peculiar sanctity. Mere moments revealed the character of the place as an ancient archive, though I could tell the nature and function of the deep halls had been forgotten by the very people who most revered it. Their superstitious ignorance only served to increase the degree of holiness which they assigned to the place. I had already seen an ample number of the wall hangings whose most common theme looked to be an epic rehearsal of the history, such as it was, of these people. This cavern housed, as might be expected, a far greater number of these tapestries, and in a state of much better preservation. That did me little good, though, as I had no historical measuring stick, nor any lexicon for their recurring symbols. At least there were frequent depictions of asterisk-like things, which I felt sure could not be intended as visual representations of any known life form, at least none habituated to dry land. I found a vast number of documents rendered in numerous media, including parchment sheets, clay tablets not unlike those so recently discovered in the library of the Assyrian potentate Ashurbanipal, even, I would swear, books of some type inscribed upon flayed human hide. Did the wide range of materials imply an unthinkably vast history of the collection itself? Had it been supplemented over long millennia? Or did the rich diversity and volume of holdings denote rather some long ago period of antiquarian zeal, during which manuscript treasures of various ages had been surreptitiously gathered by the surface-dwelling delappeurs from far and wide, outside the tunnel world below Exham Priory? Who knew? I should note that, among these records, I found new variant versions of the Gilgamesh epic, and even older sagas of a similar type, of which knowledge was long ago lost in the surface world. One was, as I judged it, a kind of Paleo-Sanskrit common basis for both the Odyssey and the Ramayana. Another text I conjecturally identified with the half-legendary Narcotic manuscript. Portions of it were written in an old Hyperborean dialect. Of this I could make little sense, but my eyes widened as I believed I deciphered something suggesting that the earliest inhabitants of this shadow realm had been refugees from the lost land of Lomar, of which ancient legend hints, and that their blasphemous traffic with and cultivation of the white, flabby brutes stemmed from their ancient subjugation of the hairy, cannibal Nofkes, their blood enemies. Still other antediluvian records contained what I took to be maps of the world, with the continents in different relative positions, and certain interlineations implied the Exham settlers had first come, via unthinkably vast tunnel passages, from much larger cavern worlds far off to the west, across the Atlantic. If only I had been able to salvage such riches! But my job extended only so far as the dull imaginations of the people I now served. No one expected me to do anything beyond custodial tasks, preserving the library, whose use they no longer understood, from simple physical disintegration. My predecessors in these tasks had not been very skilled at it, and, to tell the truth, antiquarian that I am, I performed my duties with genuine concern for the treasury which had come under my care. I think my hosts understood this on some level, and even appreciated my efforts. I might be a priest chanting a litany in a sacred tongue unknown to them, but my performance was all the more sacred as a result. I will not go so far as to say I found these poor creatures kind. It may be closer to the truth to say that they lacked any more the imagination to be cruel. They shared an endless burden of life as rote repetition, and knew nothing else. Mere life was Sisyphean futility, made more easily bearable by the tragedy that they knew no better. Accordingly, I soon ceased to fear for my own safety, and began worrying instead for my sanity. I knew I must escape and take it with me, or I should surely lose it here. The threadbare cloak I wore would surely become a capacious straitjacket if I did not contrive to leave. Every such thought brought the sudden red pain of guilt, for that I knew I should never be able to take with me the hobbled Dr. Trask. I did once risk taking the trouble of venturing a bit farther from my appointed section of our dreary warren in order to gain another glimpse of my friend. Would that I had not, for now I saw that he merely sat in his chamber, minus both legs, waiting for death. His mind was, I could see with a single look, gone for good. Closer scrutiny told me that his amputations were not, after all, medical in nature. They were cooking and eating him, piece by piece. I had allowed myself for a time to forget the sadistic degeneracy of the Delapeurs. Now I remembered, and I resolved to endure their hospitality no more. Of my escape there is little to tell. It was no great adventure. I have said both that attentive supervision was largely beyond the capacity of these light-shunning automatons, and that they came to appreciate, and therefore to trust me, at least to take for granted that my behaviour was, and would remain, quite as predictable as their own. The place seemed filled with a miasmic atmosphere of will-paralyzing lethargy, which, I confess, sapped my resolve as one day passed indistinguishably into the next. I am ashamed to say that things had reached such a pass with me that I might well have given in and awaited death, which should have come without my taking much notice. I was fairly sure that both Thea and Trask, not to mention poor Pettijohn, were dead by now. Who was I to think I had anything to risk, or any real reason to think myself deserving of a better fate than theirs? In the end, it was something I chanced to read, or to think I read, among the half-translated and contradictory histories of the Delapeur cult and race. Let us just say, for the moment, that it was sufficient to jolt me out of my shadow-fed ennui, and sent me racing, old knees a-knocking, old lungs a-wheezing, up and out from that place, with only a reluctant few pursuers rousing themselves to a sudden chase that more annoyed them than alarmed them. Their zeal to recapture me was never very great, and flagged swiftly once we began to near the slightly brighter light of the surface-leading passages. My ascent was slow. I am an old man. Though kept in sound physical health by my many archaeological delvings, my energy is quickly spent, and I had pressed on far too long in this day's mad quest. On my Orphean ascent, I was overcome once or twice by sleep, hoping resignedly that the devils from below would not decide after all to pursue me. Obviously they did not. But the knowledge I gained below Exham Priory has pursued me like an avenging spirit, like Delapeur's ghostly rats, and who knows that it will not succeed in hounding me finally to death? For the pictographs and manuscripts I examined while under house arrest made rather too clear the mocking resemblance I discerned in the too familiar lineaments of Thea's flabby beasts. What the records showed unmistakably was not a devolution from humanity's true eidolon to the quadrupedic, slope-browed imbecility of the fungus beasts. Rather, it indicated that unspeakable miscegenation between the elder ones, whatever their ultimate origin, and their vaguely hominid livestock was no innovation of the Delapeurs. No, it was by such soul-upheaving bestiality that the first human beings were created in Earth's dawn age.